Thank you all for joining us tonight for Turning Anger into Action, Creating Change Within Police Departments. My name is Lauren Peirce, Marketing Director for Sandy Spring Museum. During these very difficult times that we have all been experiencing as individuals and as a country, the museum as an organization too has been experiencing challenges, grappling with the role we play in a system that benefits some at the expense of others. Sandy Spring Museum stands firmly with those fighting against racism, structural disadvantages, and systemic injustice that have oppressed Black people in the United States for hundreds of years. The United States was built on discriminatory practices that were codified in our legal system, beginning with the dehumanization of Native people, followed by enslaving Black people in bondage as property for the financial benefit of those of white European ancestry. Sandy Spring Museum stands on land that was once a plantation where Black people were enslaved. We recognize that the museum is the beneficiary of a historically unjust system. We're committed to working toward dismantling systems that perpetuate racism and discrimination in order to build a just, equal society. Tonight's program is one of the many programs we will be hosting that challenge the dominant narrative. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Alan Sachs, our community partner with the Hub for Culture and Democracy.
Thank you, Lauren, and welcome everyone to Turning Anger into Action, brought to you by Sandy Spring Museum, Brothers with Books, and the Hub for Culture and Democracy. I'm here tonight on behalf of the Hub. We are a new community group created last year to build intentional spaces like this one for our local only and mid-county community to engage around social and racial justice issues. It's been a real privilege to have this chance to work with Brothers with Books and Sandy Spring Museum and help make this series a reality over the last several weeks. Tonight, we're going to talk about change in police departments, about the action needed to create that change, about what kinds of change might be needed, and what barriers to meaningful change may exist. I can think of a few who are better placed to lead us through that discussion than Dr. Rashawn Ray. Dr. Ray is currently a Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution and a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland, where he is also the executive director at the Lab for Applied Social Science Research. An internationally recognized thought leader on race and policing, Dr. Ray has been featured in the New York Times and Washington Post, published dozens of books and articles, and appeared on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, BBC, among many others. To help keep background noise to a minimum, please make sure your microphone is muted if it isn't already. Please use the chat respectfully. And of course, there are no stupid questions here. With that, it's an honor to turn this over to Dr. Ray.
Alan, thank you for having me. I also want to give a thanks to Lauren, who has done a lot of work to get this up to speed. Isaac and Kevin as well with Brothers with Books. As everyone can see, I clearly love books. That's what I do. I'm an academic. And so I read a lot of books. I tend to write a lot. I do a lot of research. And I've done a lot of work on policing over the past decade or so. And I'm excited to have this conversation with our guests. As we think about turning anger into action, I think about two quotes. And I was thinking about the part of the story that Kevin and Isaac told us that sort of led to Brothers with Books. And that was an experience with the police. And even though I have police officers in my family, I study policing, I know tons of police officers, probably more than most people do. I've had my fair share of experiences as well. And obviously in this moment, when we're dealing with COVID-19, it has highlighted racial disparities even more. And obviously the death of George Floyd has highlighted issues with race and policing more broadly. And I think about a couple of quotes. I think about a quote from Kimberly Jones, who said that America should just be glad that all Black people want is equity and not revenge. And I think that quote is pretty telling, because at the end of the day, whether or not people are police officers or civilians, people just want to get home to their families safely. And I think these kind of conversations, even though they're difficult, oftentimes can help lead to that outcome. I also think about the late, great John Lewis, who recently passed away. And one of his quotes that I love is him talking about the importance of getting into good trouble. I stay in good trouble. And I think many people who are on this panel with me stay in good trouble as well. And all of us are simply trying to move forward. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with each panelist. I'm going to ask a question, and in each panelist responding to that question, each panelist will introduce themselves. and then we'll have some additional questions and time for Q&A at the end. So I want to first introduce and welcome Ms. Branson, Ms. Cherri Branson. And the question that I have for you after you introduce yourself is, what are your initial thoughts on this moment that we're in? What makes this moment unique and different from the past? Based on all your experience on Capitol Hill, your experience in local communities and working with states, what makes this moment different from, say, 5 years ago when Freddie Gray was killed up in Baltimore and people were protesting, and then 6 years ago when people were protesting the death of Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and Eric Garner? What makes this moment different, Ms. Branson?
Thank you. My name is Cherri Branson, and I am currently 3rd Vice President for the Montgomery County NAACP. As you've indicated, I also served on Capitol Hill. I was a county council member for District 5 for about a year. I served as an interim, and I was procurement director for this county. So that's who I am. So what makes this moment different? I think, you've got to go further back than Freddie Gray, right? I mean, I'm, of a certain age. So, so I remember, Amadou Diallo. I remember Abner Louima. I remember this is nothing that has happened recently is different than what happened before, except video. And I think when you talk about Freddie Gray and Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice, when you think about the young men who have and Breonna Taylor, when you think about the young people who have been killed recently, you have to ask yourself, what was it about George Floyd that was different? Why didn't things explode with Trayvon? Why? And I think the answer is a multiplicity of things. First, it was people, for whatever reason, were willing to accept the excuses that were given before. They were criminals. They were doing something wrong. They were, somehow the police felt endangered. There was violence. They were bad people. There was always some justification that people, for whatever reason, were willing to believe, even when they had video that showed unspeakable actions. They were still willing to believe the justification. And here's what I think is different about George Floyd. None of those justifications applied. Absolutely none of them. What people saw was a callous disregard for human life. They saw someone who wasn't a dangerous person at that moment. They saw someone who was being held down with a knee on their neck. And they heard bystanders saying, he's in trouble, it wasn't, and they saw the expression on the officer's face, which really, I think for many people, sealed the deal. That there was a callous disregard for this man's humanity, that really just couldn't be denied any longer. And so what is different about this moment is that having seen those things, it wasn't just Black people who spoke up. We were not the only ones angry anymore. We suddenly had vocal allies and allies who were willing to protest with us. That is what has made this moment very much like the moments in the mid-60s that really spurred the civil rights movement forward. That is what has made this moment different. The notion that it really is all of us together. And maybe COVID had something to do with it, in a weird kind of way. People stuck at home, people, and people had an opportunity to really sit with this thing they saw. They had an opportunity to sit with it and hear it. And I think that has made all the difference in why you see these. There's nothing new that anyone is asking for. There's absolutely nothing new being asked for here. The NAACP and the ACLU and other groups have been asking for the same stuff for a very long time. Martin Luther King in the speech that everybody loves to quote, talked about police brutality. There is nothing new here. But what is new is how it has been embraced, and how I really believe that people are not going back to the way it was. And that I hope will make all the difference in these United States.
Ms. Branson, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, when I think about this moment, George Floyd is the Emmett Till moment of the 21st century. And you highlighted a couple of things. I mean, COVID-19, because of people quarantining at home, or supposedly supposed to, it led to a heightened awareness of that particular event. And for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, people got to see for their own eyes, to your point, that he wasn't resisting, he didn't have a weapon, he wasn't fighting back. And that highlights a very important statistic, one of the main ones that I aim to highlight when I talk about policing, that we cannot hide behind. And that is the fact that Black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when they're not attacking or have a weapon. That's George Floyd. We also know that every 40 hours in the United States, a Black person is killed by police. That's Breonna Taylor. And because those three officers stood there, while Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, that's part of what I call, and what others call, bad apples coming from rotten trees in policing. We talk about Chauvin as if he's a bad apple, but he had to come from somewhere. And anybody who does farming and planting knows that if you have some bad crops, well, then it came oftentimes from a bad plant. And that's something that we oftentimes don't like to highlight. We also know from the research that I've done that there are collateral consequences to policing. There are illness spillovers, where it's not simply about who might have been brutalized in that moment or arrested or even killed, but that it spills over into neighborhoods. And part of it spilling over is that it impacts men's mental health, that men who are in neighborhoods that are over-policed, that have pervasive stop and frisk policies and racial profiling, they have higher levels of depression, higher levels of anxiety. In those same neighborhoods, women have worse physical health, higher rates of obesity, higher blood pressure, and a higher likelihood for heart disease. These are some of the main consequences that play out. So with that being said, I want to turn to Chief Jones and ask, and of course, everyone should know who the chief is, but Chief Jones, feel free to say whatever you like to say about yourself. So some people, in thinking about this bad apple, people are calling Derek Chauvin a bad apple. And obviously, I mean, he had nearly 20 complaints against him. I think the incident with George Floyd made 18. But George Floyd's death is emblematic of a broader pattern of brutality. And to many, Derek Chauvin is part of a broader systemic and cultural problem in law enforcement. So what are your thoughts on how people think about bad apples versus organizational, culture, and systemic problems in law enforcement? Chief Jones.
Thank you, Dr. Ray, and I appreciate the opportunity, and I am very happy to be with the Sandy Spring Museum this evening, and all of my panelists, fellow panelists, and all guests. And I love the books behind you, Dr. Ray, especially that Alpha Phi Alpha book that's behind you. I just put my shameless plug in there. Just so everyone knows, I've been Montgomery County police officer here for 34 plus years, nearly 35. And I've seen lots during the course of my career. I've seen the transition throughout Montgomery County and in law enforcement across this country in many different facets. And I think you raise a great question, Dr. Ray, when we have 18,000 police departments in the United States of America. And when you look at systemic and institutionalized racism that stems from many generations, and it really takes bold leadership to break those change, you might say, and make those changes that need to happen as we look at how communities are policed all throughout this country. Even in Montgomery County, we have to take a hard look at that. So from a systematic standpoint, when you know you have high crime in certain area, let's say you have narcotics distribution and high crime or high drug usage in a particular area, the question becomes, as a police department, do you look at a way to actually solve that problem, or are you just trying to arrest your way out of that situation and think that it's going away? And there's a lot of things that are beyond policing that has impact in many of our communities, particularly communities of color, when it comes to economics, just as you talked about a little bit with health disparities and other things that have a negative impact from a governmental standpoint of how to resolve these issues to create safe environments. Because we know, as a matter of fact, that I know this for real, that our communities expect their communities to be safe. They want to have the opportunity to go out and allow their children to play in the playgrounds from that standpoint. So the question becomes, how do I look at things from a standpoint of what do we do in the police department to change the environment? And one of the things I would suggest to you is that what I think is what's most important is what we call legitimacy in policing. That is the actions that we move forward with, and whether it's enforcement, education, is that there is a reason why, a legitimate reason for public safety that's going to be the betterment of the community. It doesn't always evolve into an arrest. It shouldn't always evolve into an arrest to solve that particular situation. There are people that I've done and seen in communities where it was about individuals who fell into a trap, you might say, of drug distribution because they didn't have a job. They didn't have transportation to jobs. There's communities where that they didn't have the bus service that ran to, for example, in some of the rural parts of our county, to other areas where there were more opportunities, and even communities somehow shut them down because they knew they were from a particular area and didn't give them the job opportunity. So from a standpoint of legitimacy, that's important. When you look again at departmental systems, particularly like something with Derek Chauvin, when you look at that many complaints against an officer, departments have to have an early warning system that dictates to us, that says that we've got an employee who's got some serious issues and it needs to be looked into a lot deeper. And those systems have to be evaluated continuously. It can't be just you put it into place, you say you have it, but nobody, as time changes, people change in positions for many reasons of retirement or beyond. And so people like a Derek Chauvin, that when you have an employee that's have that constant problem, you really got to take a deeper look in that and try to figure out how to resolve and give that officer a deeper look of accountability. Is there training that officer needs? What's missing? When we look at diversity, all throughout our communities, one of the things we've always found is the fact that our officers really need to know the communities in which they're going to work. And they've got to be educated about our different communities and the impact that they're going to have in those communities based upon those issues. So with that being said, I think that's a larger issue from a standpoint that we really have to look at legitimacy, and we really have to have a high value of accountability, and really, to really show that we are doing something about the problem employees and not just talking it, but actually walking the walk.
Chief Jones, thank you for that. I mean, one of the big things you highlighted is something that I see play out in my research all the time, is that police departments, police officers, similar to healthcare professionals, similar to teachers, are the ones who get dumped on with a lot of the broader systemic problems. And oftentimes, if we really want to deal with crime, which no one wants crime in their neighborhood, we have to deal with education equity and a work infrastructure. So oftentimes police officers get dealt with that, but they're not really aiming to solve, or they really can't solve the broader systemic problem about why crime is happening. So they end up dealing with those particular issues. And so on that front, I want to turn to Mr. Thomas. So Mr. Thomas, after you introduce yourself, and one of the things that the chief was talking about here is accountability. You know, there aren't a lot of ways for police chiefs to really hold officers like Chauvin accountable. There are ways in which they have the ability to keep going through things. I mean, I think Minneapolis is a really good example of that, where the chief in Minneapolis in 2007, along with 4 other Black officers, sued his department for failure to promote and for discipline against minority officers. Won nearly an $800,000 lawsuit. And then, of course, went on to run internal affairs, where a lot of those complaints were from Chauvin were underneath him. And then he became chief. And of course, he was dealing with a fraternal order of police, and still is, that I think many people would consider to be quite honorary, and still teaching a warrior style course where they are teaching chokeholds, even though chokeholds have been something that the Minneapolis Police Department no longer does. And they've choked out dozens of people in their department. So my question to you after you introduce yourself is, as police unions, as fraternal order of police chapters and unions have come under scrutiny for being the main culprit of cultural problems, how do you see things, or what do you say to people who say that fraternal order of police unions have too much power instead of the public having that power to actually play a role in how they're policed?
Thank you, Dr. Ray, and I want to thank you all for having me here and being with this distinguished panel. I started in Montgomery County as a police officer, and really had an incredible amount of opportunity to learn and to hone my skills before I moved on. And when I left Montgomery County, I went to Johns Hopkins University, where I taught in the Division of Public Safety Leadership for 11 years before doing a stint at the Pentagon, and then landing where I am now at the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And there I have the opportunity to go across the country and do a lot of work with police departments on many of these very issues. One of the projects that I work on is collective healing in the time of harm. That is, it was developed to address these very type of issues and to really instill communication, coordination, and collaboration between law enforcement and their community partners, because this is something that no one entity in the community can do by themselves. This is where we have to work together and move forward together. With respect to unions and guilds and so forth, I think sometimes the pendulum can swing too far to one side or the other. And in some of these agencies, the union literally almost has a stranglehold on the chief. You know, individuals will look from the outside looking in, and why doesn't the chief do this? Why doesn't the chief do that? Well, they don't have that unilateral power to do this and that in many of these agencies with really strong unions. And that's when it's incumbent upon those other community members, those other community stakeholders to help hold the union accountable. You know, law enforcement is supposed to be about providing safety and service to the entire community. And anytime union decisions or things that they demand impact in a negative way the safety of the community, that's a problem. And that needs to be adequately addressed. There are I've had a lot of individuals come to me since the George Floyd incident and were shocked at how much power some of the unions have. And then you look at some of the union leaders in some of these cities, whether it's New York or Minneapolis or Philadelphia, and how toxic those union leaders are when they talk about some of these topics and so forth. And this isn't a thing where, you know, we're trying to throw any officers under the bus. You know, if the community knew about how much good so many officers out there do day in and day out, those good stories that are there, they don't bubble up, they don't rise to the surface. That's not something that's going to be on CNN. But we do have these bad eggs in where the culture of the agency has not been as healthy. You see more problems, and you see more problems again and again and again in some of those agencies. Where you have a healthier culture, where you have an agency where the chief is able to have the ability to make certain there's accountability at every level, right? And that there's checks and balances, that there's early warning systems like the chief mentioned, where so that we can be able to address something before it gets, it gets too bad. And, also realizing that, being a police officer to me is an honor and a privilege, right? And you don't have a right to be a police officer. So if you don't want to be accountable, if you don't want to go by what you raised your right hand and swore to do, to me, that's fine. Get another job. But if you want to do what you rose your right hand and swore to do, then you have no problem with the accountability that's being asked for by the public after George Floyd or before George Floyd. So it's a thing of where, with our law enforcement leaders having the support so that they can effectively do that. So there's, to me, there's a lot of accountability to go around. And so and we want to be accountable. We need to be accountable. Everybody needs to be accountable, but we need to do this in a concerted way. We need to do it in a way where we're communicating and we're working together, and we're not throwing stones at each other, right? This is something we have to, channel that angst and so forth. And this is something too, when it comes, a lot of people are having a hard time facing up to this because it's a wound. And Dr. King taught us that a wound can't heal as long as it's covered up. It has to be opened to the healing properties of air and light. So this means having intentional conversations about these issues that we're facing and finding ways to effectively address it.
Yeah, great point. So what I'm loving about this is we have quite a bit of time for Q&A, and it's great because some of the questions that I figured that people would come up with are things that I presented to you all. So we're going to go rapid fire. Let's get into a next question, and I want to get all three of you to reflect on this question so we could just go back in the same order that we had it. So obviously, and this question comes from Christina Flies, and it's about defund the police, or the statement defund the police. And I think what's important before we move forward, before you all respond, is it's important for people to recognize, and I've written about this extensively, that when people say defund the police, they don't mean abolish the police. That's something different. When people say defund the police, oftentimes they mean reallocate funding away from funding that is within the police department to other social services. So based on that definition, that's the approach we're going to start with. And so as protesters and activists and the public now are calling for defunding the police, what are your thoughts on this? So I think what I'll do, I'll start with Ms. Branson, and then we'll just go around. So what are your thoughts on defund the police, reallocating funding within, in this case, county government structure away from police department budgets to other social services?
Well, let me just be clear. I learned a long time ago that anytime we as a society decide that the answer to the problem is law enforcement, then we have decided to give up on it. I mean, if you look at the difference between the response to the crack cocaine epidemic versus the response to our current opioid epidemic, you know, you will see just a total 360 change in the response, because the crack epidemic was seen as a law enforcement problem, and so the answer was lock them up and throw away the key. The opioid epidemic is seen as a public health problem, and so the answer is get them treatment. So that's a really long way of saying when we ask the police to do things that they are not trained to do, when we decide they're the answer to the problem, then we have decided we have given up. So what we need to do is pick it back up and stop giving up. You know, mental health services in this county, in this nation, should not rely on, you should not have to call the police if someone in your house is having a mental health problem. There should be someone else you can call. You should not have to, you know, call the police if one of your neighbors is, you know, outside, you know, yelling and screaming and appears to be having some sort of, you know, mental health issue. We ask the police to be truant officers, mental health officers, you know, just a long list of things. And because, you know, and then we throw some money at it. You know, the bottom line is we have to stop throwing money at that, and we have to start figuring out how to invest the money into systems that actually have a compassionate and data-driven response to the problems that we as a society face. You know, the police are not, we cannot ask them to do all things. They're not trained for that. They didn't sign up for that. And frankly, I don't want people with guns doing these things. I want other people doing these things. So I don't like the term defund the police because I think it is provocative. And I think it scares people, quite frankly. But I prefer the term right size the police budget, and to right size the other departmental budgets that have to be increased in order to provide the kind of data-driven response and hopefully solutions to the problem the society faces.
Chief Jones, and I know you responded in the chat, but feel free to give your verbal response here.
Absolutely. So, and so I agree with Ms. Branson when she speaks to issues about the mental health issues in our community. Over the past 30 years, it is well known that the federal government, state and local governments really gave up on the mental health community and did not provide them with the resources and really pushed them out into the streets. I remember when I first came on the police department and you had an individual going through a mental health crisis, we had the ability to take that individually, if necessary, to a hospital, Springfield State Hospital, to provide them with services that they needed. That hospital no longer exists. And so now police departments have been really, when you look at homelessness, you look at these mental health issues that are in our communities and well throughout in many different facets. We as the police department become the last line of defense, you might say. We become the easy phone number to pick up and call 911. And so one of the things we have been talking about in county government, when we talk about reimagining policing, but we were talking about this a while back when we really were talking about trying to figure out a better way to provide these services to individuals going through crisis at the time, and not that an arrest would be the end to the end all. That you had somewhere to take these people. Our hospitals are getting getting overran in emergency rooms. Our officers are getting tied up on taking these individuals to hospitals. And so I am looking for the opportunity, and we've got some really good options that are before us. We're hoping that we can get something really going strong within the next year or so that's really going to give the people who are going through mental health crisis, give them the ability to have someone who is specifically trained in mental health, clinician work, who can assist them in a manner that it's not a police officer that's coming to knock on the door. I can tell you there are lots of calls that we get on a daily basis that we shouldn't be responding to. But at the end of the day, right, the easiest call is when someone calls 911 or calls our number, we're gonna come. We're not totally dismissing anybody's response. But at the end of the day, when we get there, we have to figure out, this is not something we need to handle. We need to give that to someone else. Now, so as it relates to defunding the police, as you note that as I'm a strong advocate in order to provide these resources with people who are having substance abuse issues and the like, what I'm suggesting to you all, what defunding our police department will be detrimental. I've got an 80% budget. 80% of my budget goes to personnel costs and benefits. And 20% is really operational costs. In a community that we have 1.1 million people. And there's an expectation of service still in this community. And I think rightfully so, in order to maintain a safe community. Just because police officers will be sort of redirected and given other responsibilities, and that they can put more emphasis on community engagement. We can really get into our communities and come up with relationship building and do a better job of that because we're not tied up in some of these other calls that are before us. And so that's what I'm looking for us to make this change that gives us the ability. But when you're taking money away from me, that means I'm not giving my officers the best training. If you want a good police department, you have to invest in training. That's vitally important. Just because we get our recruits through at the very beginning, we have to train our veteran officers each and every year. We have to provide them with the best possible training for the numbers of folks that we have. And taking monies away, I will tell you, will have a negative impact in that regard. So that's why I am totally against the so-quote, and I hate that term as well, but when we talk about this issue of defunding the police.
Mr. Thomas.
Yeah, I just want to follow up quickly on what the chief said. I think, training, I preach training. When I was with Montgomery County, I taught at our police academy for 5 years, and training is fundamental. Training has to happen so everybody can stay up so that they can stay sharp. There's nobody out there who has a vehicle would think about, buying a vehicle and never taking it in for a tune-up. That's what training is. Training is perishable also. And we learn things when there are innovations. The way that we approach CPR is different today than it was in 1986 when I came into the academy. Why? Because we've learned more about how to do emergency response when we have somebody who is in cardiac arrest, right? We've come a long way. So we've changed, and the agency has to be able to do that too. And the only way they can do that is through that training that officers receive on an annual basis, and that all costs, I too hate the term defund the police because of the connotation that it has. And we're talking about perhaps there does need to be some restructuring, but let's make certain where that restructuring happens that we aren't causing unintended consequences. And that's what the chief talked about, that, okay, now I can't do these things because my budget is so severely cut, and the community still wants the same level of service. Now, there are programs out there are communities out there who have done some restructuring. I forget exactly where it's from, but there's a program called Cahoots, which does some of this. Their dispatch center is such that when the call comes in, they have mental health, licensed mental health people and so forth who can go directly to some of these calls. They have marked cars. They have uniforms that are particular to them. It's kind of like having, law enforcement, fire rescue, and then having Cahoots, right? but these individuals have to collaborate and talk together and everything. So certain aspects of this can and absolutely should be done. But this isn't something that should be a knee-jerk type of thing. We really got to look at it, and we really have to make certain that what we want to get out of it, we are going to get out of it. So I think that's where, you know, Ms. Branson and Chief Marcus hit on some excellent points about how to get there.
Yeah, I mean, Ms. Branson brought up a great point about, and you two highlighting the problems people have with the term. And of course, to your point, I mean, the term is provocative. So, I mean, if you're at a protest, I mean, it looks good on a sign, but of course, when we sit down at a table to negotiate, we use other words like reallocate, shift, restructure. Mm-hmm. And honestly, that happens all the time. I mean, it's happened, I think, more so, which people have paid attention to it recently, but it's important to think about that. And I was doing one of these the other day with Congressman Bass, of course, who headed up the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And one of the things that she was saying that made a lot of sense to me is that instead of saying maybe defund the police, maybe we say reinvest in communities, because at the end of the day, that's what everyone wants. And even some of the points you all are making. I think one good approach that we've highlighted at the Brookings Institution is that police departments and really governments, less police departments, more so county council members, city council members, need to perform what I call a calls for service and clearance rate market-driven audit. What do I mean by that? Well, we're getting a lot of questions about calls for service and, you know, how we think about training. We're going to get to training in a second. But nationally, one thing we know about calls for service is that 9 out of 10 calls for service have nothing to do with anything violent. Now, as you all know, some of you all know as police officers, it doesn't mean that those things won't turn violent. But overwhelmingly, these calls for service are not about violence. The other thing we know, though, is that a large percentage, in some places 40 to 50% of calls for service are about someone who's having a mental health episode and a person who's dealing with addiction. And so now all of a sudden you couple that with the training that officers have received, oftentimes to respond to worst case scenarios, not always to respond to people who might be suicidal or having an addiction. And then, of course, we know because officers have to do a host of these things, depending on where you're located at, the clearance rate, the violent crime clearance rate is horrible. Now, I think it's much better in Montgomery County, and the chief can talk about this, but nationally, one thing we know is that about 40% of homicides go unsolved. About 70% of robberies and aggravated assaults go unsolved. And one thing I think is that if officers were able to focus on more of those type of incidents and less of all the things they're responding to, I think we might see an improvement in the clearance rate. So this next question is about training. Let's stick on that topic. We got a couple of questions from that, from Kathleen Halverson, as well as from Deborah Legowski. Hopefully I got the name right. And one thing that Kathleen is saying is that how much of training focuses on soft skills, communication, and de-escalation? I mean, and this is, I think, specifically for Montgomery County. One thing we know nationally, when officers come through the academy, they receive about 50 hours of firearm training, but less than 10 hours of de-escalation training. Is that different in Montgomery County? And what is the length of time for training before a person becomes an officer? Should the training length be increased to include interacting with mental health and special needs besides just one class? So I think let's do this. Let's start with the chief, then we'll go to Mr. Thomas, and if Ms. Branson wants to chime in on that question, feel free.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ray. That's a great question. So I think what's important for everyone to realize is that training is vitally important in what we do. And our training academy, to first start off, is that it is a 26-week training academy for 6 months. All of our officers have to meet certification needs by the Maryland State Police Training Commission that certifies officers annually. Now, what's important is that when we look at de-escalation, and this is a very important piece, because de-escalation continues to evolve. There are many different types of situations in order to try to de-escalate. we've embedded de-escalation in all phases of our academy throughout that 26-week period. In the different curriculum that we have, the hands-on experiences that we're putting the officers through. We're putting them through scenario-based training so that we can try to work through the de-escalation skills and try to give them more of those skills and to get them to think differently. And that's vitally important when we're doing this. One of the things that we've also really embedded is our crisis intervention training that we're really starting to give our recruits this very early in their curriculum. What we have not done before, we've generally waited until they've gotten through, even though we provide them with a lot of different aspects and exposure to different mental health crises such as autism, dealing with people who have dementia and Alzheimer's and other types of schizophrenia issues. But we've really given them this option to really, not so much an option, but to embed them with crisis intervention training. If an officer has a taser, they've gone through crisis intervention training. Now, one of the things is that we haven't required all of our officers to have tasers, but we're working to try to give more of our patrol officers those tools that could be, again, a less lethal option if necessary, if the officer has to use some sort of force. So with that being said, I think it's vitally important that, again, that investment in training, just because they go through the 6-month academy, training doesn't stop there. We go through, again, 14 weeks of additional field observation that we know that they can function as a single officer, but that we also are monitoring them throughout their probationary period, and their supervisors are rating them annually to make sure that these skills are being actively done. And if there's a need to send an officer back to the academy for remedial type training, we do that, and we highly emphasize that due to the fact that we've got officers that might have some issues, and that's always on our radar.
Yeah, you know, once again, as I harped on earlier, the training is key, and we do have to do more in policing when it comes to addressing the soft skills. We do a pretty good job when it comes to addressing the hard skills, but the soft skills really, I think we have to bring up a little more. I know in Montgomery County, they've done a very good job for a long time when it comes to recruiting and the hiring process. And that is a key also. And one of the main things we have to look for is character, and we have to make certain that oath I talked about before is something that they continue to adhere to. And they have to. It's important that we teach them, the true history of policing. History in this country, much of it started with slave patrols, and talk about the history of policing underserved communities and so forth. So officers, some of the young officers especially, and some of the old ones, can understand why this discontent is out there. Understand things like trauma and historical trauma and how that can affect generations. Looking at implicit bias and how that impacts the way one carries themselves. I mean, every one of us has implicit bias, has unconscious biases, because 98% of brain function is unconscious. There's probably nobody listening to this webinar that thought about blinking this whole time. I thought about breathing in and out. That's because your brain takes care of it. It's unconscious. There are certain behaviors that we engage in that are unconscious. And so that's where we have to try to get people to look at the behaviors, look at the actions we take, and kind of really hold themselves accountable. I said there's a lot of accountability to go around, and this is where we can look to hold ourselves accountable and see what kind of biases, negative biases that we have that could impact somebody. Understanding how trauma affects the community and how that trauma can color the way that individual, interacts with us, understanding the vicarious trauma that people in the helping fields tend to be subject to, because when you're hearing the trauma stories of others, it can have an impact on you. So what are we doing to take care of those who in the helping fields who are having to deal with these traumas day in and day out? What type of wellness programs do we have? Because not only do we have to, as I mentioned earlier, take care of our fleet of vehicles and give them tune-ups, we got to tune up our people, and we've got to take care of them mentally, right? And so, all of that kind of comes together, and we're doing that a lot better. We're definitely doing a lot better than we did way back when I came on. And I think Marcus would agree with me there. We're doing a lot better job of that. CRT, the crisis, CRT wasn't even thought of back then. A lot of these things weren't thought of, but we're thinking we're doing a lot better. So, that's where what I would, how I'd address this.
Okay, one thing I want to do, I want to make a statement. Then I want to go to Ms. Branson and ask a broad question, and then the third thing I want to do is come to Chief Jones to close us out on a comment that he just made. So let me see if we can get all this done in 5 minutes. All right. So to everyone who asked questions, we appreciate them. I know that Chief Jones and others are responding to those. But one of the things that I think Chief Jones highlighted, as well as Mr. Thomas, I know at the University of Maryland, where I'm the director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, we have an innovative virtual reality decision-making program where officers go through it and make decisions. We have some officers from Montgomery County come through that, and I can tell you, some of the officers who are part of the crisis management program in Montgomery County who deal with mental health are the best officers I've seen around the country. I mean, we've worked with hundreds of police officers. It's the best I've seen. It actually needs to be a model. And of course, our course is approved by the Maryland State Police Training Commission. And so thinking about these broader points, and I want to ask Ms. Branson this, and then I want to come to the chief. So we got questions from Perry Johnson, who I'm just going to shout out, who is joining us from St. Louis, is one of the best people and best police officers who I've ever had the opportunity to come in touch with. And then we also got a question from Ed. So one question is about trust, all right? That the broader point is that trust has been lost, particularly in predominantly minority communities. So Ms. Branson, I'm hoping you can address that. And then Chief, I'm hoping that you can then not only speak to trust, but also speak to what Perry asked, which is, what is your department doing to address the social issues that plague Black communities before they become criminal issues? And I know we talked about that some, but I hope in your response, not only can you say the work you're doing, but I'm hoping that you can also speak to the future hiring of the civilian assistant chief, which I think is really innovative. So let's start with Ms. Branson, then we'll go to Chief. Let's see if we can get all this done in 4 minutes.
Okay, here we go. This is gonna be the speed round. So first of all, I do want to say something about the training piece, because I think training is great. If people need to be retrained, but quite frankly, there's some things you can't train for. There are just some personality traits that you cannot untrain. And so the monitoring and the way that we get people into the force has to be complemented with the way we get people out of the force. And that has to do with your question about trust. I really do believe that trust is severely damaged, if not broken. And I think in any relationship, be it between the people and the police, cousins, brothers and sisters, when trust has been damaged, what is required is transparency and accountability, and maybe a little contrition thrown in. People have to be willing to admit that there are things wrong, that there are things broken. We are going to fix them, and we are going to deal with folks who are not willing to toe the line, and we are going to provide incentives to people who are actually modeling the behavior that we say we want. If all we're doing is punishing the bad folks, and we may not even be doing that, then, you know, I too was a director of an agency in this county, and, you know, and supervised people for a long time. And one thing I've learned is that, you know, if you are, if you are rewarding the good kids, but not punishing the bad kids, then the good kids are going to start saying to themselves, why am I working this hard? You know, this is human nature. We're not going to be able to change that. So those are, you know, when it comes to building trust, we have to realize that this community's trust, the Black and brown community's trust, is broken - non-existent. I personally am afraid to call the police. I really would really have to have a crisis to call the police. And, you know, I'm a middle-aged, middle-class Black woman. Why am I afraid to call the police? So it's because I'm really afraid of what could happen, you know? And that's the point that folks have to start, that somebody like me shouldn't be afraid to call the police. That's the breach of trust. So, you know, accountability, making sure that people actually get are actually disciplined when they do wrong will go a long way to restoring my trust in the system.
Chief.
So yeah, what I think is vitally important when you have a relationship, when you talk about trust, it takes work on both sides. It's not a one-way street. And people have to be willing to lower the barriers, to listen and have discussions, and not just be one-sided conversation. We as a police department can't just say it's a us versus them mentality. That's the wrong approach. It is a collective community partnership. If you want a better community, you want a safer community, you want a community of trust, you've got to be able to build that. So one of the reasons why we're bringing in a civilian assistant chief as an example is that we're looking at this community resource bureau that's going to really look at our policies as evidence-based policing and really work at growing our community engagement in order to get people to start to let these barriers down. You know, again, we know that there are many communities that they sometimes need us the most, but they trust us the least, right? And that's a reality, okay? We know that in policing, but at the end of the day, right, we're from the human race. We can't be treated like robots, right? People have got to understand that you can have a relationship with a police officer. I've been here for 34 years. I've raised my 3 children in this community. My wife is an advocate. We are church-going people embedded in this community. What makes me different? That I have a gun, that I have the powers of arrest. Yes, I get that. But in my 34 years, the best news of the day is I've never pulled the trigger on my gun. Because from what I've always deemed to be the best and most effective tool that any police officer has is your communication ability, the ability to talk and the ability to listen. And that we need the community to understand and respect that part, because if you treat us differently, then many officers are going to be because they're going to feel like they're less than. And you continue to treat people who are less than, they become disengaged. They don't want to really go out to do what they, have set out to do, because again, we're from the human race. We have to keep that morale up and really boost that. And we need the community to partner with us in order for us to have success at that.
Yeah, well, look, I hate we're out of time. As I bring Alan back up, it's a few things that I think about. We need what I call gap protections, good apple protections for officers who are trying to do better and changing the incentive structure. We also can't treat officers like they're robots. Studies show that 80% of officers suffer from chronic stress. They're overworked, oftentimes underpaid. That's a recipe where racial biases go on overdrive and impact some of the outcomes that we have. And then I know, Chief, you'll probably follow up on this. It was a series of questions about the 8 Can't Wait from Campaign Zero, about what the county's doing for that. But unfortunately, we're out of time. Alan, is back over to you.
Thank you. This was such a necessary and important discussion this evening. Thank you, Dr. Ray, for your incomparable insight and leadership this evening. Thank you to each of our excellent panelists, Cherri, Branson, Chief Jones, Dave Thomas. we're so privileged to have your participation tonight. And thanks to everyone who joined us tonight for your engagement, your continued activism. We'll be posting this conversation on various platforms over the coming days. Please join us on July 29th, next Wednesday, for our 5th and final installment of Turning Anger into Action. We'll have a conversation on coalition building and how to bridge the gap between established and marginalized communities. Lauren?
Thank you, everybody, again for joining us this evening. As Alan mentioned, next week's our last session for Turning Anger into Action. And if you have not yet registered, you can do so at sandyspringmuseum.org/action. Have a good night.